What's up, YouTube? It's Leo again, Coach White Belt, and today I'm going to be talking about FloWrestling Radio Live, episode 500, where Ben Askren says that he doesn't believe in talent, or doesn't believe that talent exists. So Christian Powers was arguing the other side, and he says he believes it does exist. And I can sort of understand both of their sides, and maybe the one that is more intuitive or maybe more evident is Christian's side, saying that talent does exist. And his argument is, if you were to compare maybe some kids who have never been trained in a particular thing, you take two kids and you tell them to wrestle one another and try to pin each other, that one of them will have a natural aptitude for the particular activity and would be able to out wrestle the other kid, even though they both have no training in this. Ben Askren's argument to this was sort of that, well, you don't know what has led up to that moment. If that happens when they're 10 years old and one of them has spent the majority of the time on the couch playing video games and the other one spends it outside kicking a ball or playing on the playground or whatever it is, then that would lead to one of the children being more athletic than the other. And then Christian's rebuttal to that was that if you were to take two kids and train them both equally, even from day one, that you would still have a winner and you would still have a loser. And so Ben went on to say that if you were to take a child from when they're born and you were to say maybe do some sort of tests on them, some sort of observations to them, and determine sort of what their natural aptitude is at the moment, and you say, oh, they're not genetically predisposed for maybe to be all that strong or to be all that explosive or for endurance or whatever it happens to be, and that you could change that genetic predisposition within those first 2 years and say, if this human, this person who is going to be growing up to, and I'm raising them to say be a wrestler, and their Achilles heel in their natural aptitude might be strength, that you could within those 2 years change that by sort of facilitating growth in that particular attribute. And they sort of agreed on these attributes that are constituent for success in wrestling. And I just thought it was a very interesting argument from both sides, really. And Ben Askren did use some logical fallacies, which I would say I'm not surprised by. It's not the first time I've heard him use it to maybe win the argument. And the two that he used mainly were the straw man. The straw man is to sort of weaken someone else's argument, or just to oversimplify it to make it easier to sort of to sort of knock down or to discount. And so Christian would give his side of his argument, and then Ben Askren would say, so what you're basically saying is, and then he'd give like this general simplified version of what Chris was saying, and then Chris would respond promptly with, that's not what I said, or that's not what I meant, and then Ben would carry on with his side of the argument. The other one was the appeal to ignorance. So the appeal to ignorance is to make the statement that something is either true or not true based on the other person or anyone's inability to disprove their claim. So if I were to say that I saw a UFO in the sky, if I saw a flying saucer in the sky one day, there's not really any way that anyone could disprove what I'm saying. And so if I were to use this logical fallacy, I would say, so then it must be true because you can't disprove what I'm saying. Which, of course, is kind of nonsense, because the lack of proof is inconclusive. The lack of proof doesn't say that it is true or that it's not true. It says that we can't know based on this that it is true or it's not true. And there's so many other things that come into this, and this is something that, like, being an engineering student and sort of hearing about science or arguments about science or against science, more specifically, kind of infuriating, because people say it's a theory, it's not a proof. It's not proof, it's a theory. Well, I'll tell you right now, theory is practically proof. And the reason I say practically proof is because it has enough supporting evidence that it's widely accepted, not only within its community, but even outside of its community. So the reason for this, is that there is no such thing as proof. There's no such thing as proof. And you could say, well, what if you see it? What if you feel it? What if you taste it? What if your senses could all be wrong, first of all. Your eyes could be seeing something that's not there. Your hands could be feeling something that's not there. You could hear something that's not there. And so that's not proof. And say that there's some way to create an optical illusion, right? If you take 100 people in a room and someone does a magic trick, and everyone in the room agrees on what they saw, and they say, yes, that's what I saw, that's what happened. Even if everyone else is convinced by it, it's not proof. It's not irrefutable proof. The only way that something can be proof is that it cannot be disproven, but there's no way to prove that it can't be disproven. And so, there's no such thing as proof. And so theory is really the best we have. And what people think of as theory, when they say that's just a theory, what they actually think of is it's just a hypothesis, where a hypothesis is an idea for why something might have happened or why something occurs, or some sort of explanation. So if you see a broken table, for example, and you ask 10 people, how do you think this table broke? They will all come up with a hypothesis, which is an idea leading to this particular conclusion. And someone could say, the table was cut. And then you would go in and you would look at the evidence being inspecting the table in any way that you might want, to look for evidence supporting or refuting the idea that it was cut. And if you see, well, there's not really a clean line, there are many inconsistencies throughout or jagged edges where you can see the individual fibers of the wood itself, and there's no sawdust anywhere. And that leads me to believe that it's not very likely that it was cut. And then someone could say, well, perhaps it was broken in half, right, with some sort of blunt force. Or maybe too heavy of an object was placed on it, and the strength of the table was not enough to hold it, or whatever it may be. So, but there's evidence that sort of supports the idea that something is either more probable or less probable, but not that it didn't happen. And so there's no such thing as proof. And that's just me being a nerd, so don't worry about that rant too much. But I thought it was interesting while listening to this sort of argument between Ben Askren and Christian Piles. So, although Ben Askren does believe that one person may have an advantage in one way or another compared to someone else for a particular thing, whether one person might be stronger than another, even if they're on the same training program since day one, he believes that in a sort of complex activity like wrestling, that you could train someone to play to their strengths, to develop their sort of weaknesses, to such an extent that they could still be competitive. That they could still be not only competitive but successful. So maybe that comes from him being a wrestler. Maybe that comes from him being a wrestling coach. Maybe that's from him wanting to instill that in his students, his kids that he trains, and his own kids, and in himself maybe. Or maybe he really just doesn't believe in this sort of concept of talent. And I did sort of understand when Chris would make his argument for his side, and then Ben would sort of say something to maybe give reasonable doubt as to that having been a result of talent. That he would say, see, so there is no talent. I don't agree with that, because again, appeal to ignorance doesn't say that that's all of a sudden talent, or that talent doesn't exist. But I do think that it also says that it's not proof of talent. It is evidence of talent, like as Chris was stating, but it's not proof of it. It's not sufficient proof, at least to me. And that's really what it takes. It's really what it's up to, is whether that's enough to convince me, or whether that's enough to convince you, or to convince Ben, or to convince somebody else. But if he thinks that because it sort of loans itself to self-improvement, to completely remove the idea of talent, then I think that's really cool. I think that's really good. Sorry, the camera just cut there for a second, but I think you see that in kids a lot, especially competitive kids, really competitive kids. You can have a competitive kid, you can have two really, really competitive kids, and that doesn't mean that they're going to push themselves hard to succeed. One of them might see someone else winning, or might lose at a particular activity and say, I can't stand to lose. And they'll think, what can I do to win next time? What are some things that I can do? Can I work harder? Can I practice more? Can I learn strategy that would improve my chances of success? And then the other kid might say, I'm just no good at this. And if you can get rid of that idea in a kid, which is something I would say a lot of kids, I've coached kids class, I coached it for quite a while. I coached my own kid. And of course, I was a kid myself. I've done plenty of kids, nieces, nephews, and plenty of others. And we all know how this situation goes, that there are many, many children who are discouraged easily. And maybe not the first time, but by the time that we see it, that they've been discouraged enough times that they can't self-encourage. And when they fail at something, or maybe not even fail, but just don't excel at something, they're just not excellent the moment that they try it, and they think, I'm just no good at this. Or they see someone who's better than they are at it, and they think, I'm just not good at this. And this would happen with my son. He would be discouraged when he was at wrestling, or when he was at jiu-jitsu, or whatever it was, or he would lose a karate sparring match. And he'd be really bummed out because he really hates losing. Really hates losing. I would say I do too, but I've just sort of come to, lost enough times throughout life that you sort of develop thick skin for it. You know that losing is just part of the game. It's part of the process. And it gives you the opportunity for growth. You can sort of see where your mistakes were, and see where your opponent excelled, how they beat you, and think of new ways to sort of get around that, to improve yourself. But when you're a child, you don't see that. Well, not never, but in my experience, many kids don't see it. They just see I lost. And I have had to push my son, and I had to remind him. I tell him all the time I encourage him that if you're not good at something and you want to be good at it, you can train and you can become good at it. This is something I tell people about for mathematics all the time, and maybe they won't believe because they felt like they've never been good at math. Where someone like me, I had a really easy time with math in middle school and in high school, and I got through the calc series 1, 2, and 3. So, and I maybe spent less time studying than some of my peers. Of course, there are people way beyond my ability. I'm not here to gloat. I've had a college professor who got his doctorate in his 20s. But, you know, I know that I've had an easier time of it than some other people have in some ways with mathematics specifically. But I encourage people who say, oh, I'm just not good at math. Or I would like to pursue something like engineering, but I'm just no good at math. Or I'm just not good at math. Or I've just never been good at math. Or I'll just never be good at math. And I try to discourage that as much as possible. When I hear someone say that I tell them, look, I struggle through my classes as well. And there have been some classes that I didn't pass the first try. You know? And you don't have to, you shouldn't expect yourself to be at the same level of maybe someone who is your age, but has spent more time doing this particular activity than you have. And you'll learn this really quickly if you're in your 30s like me, and you go into a grappling class and you think like, yeah, right, like some 20-year-old kid or some 15-year-old kid is going to beat me up, right? And you go in and you get handled. You get handled repeatedly by somebody smaller than you, somebody younger than you. Somebody that you, with your ego, might say to yourself that they are less than you are in these particular ways, or that they're younger than you, they're weaker than you, they're smaller than you, they're dumber than you, they're whatever insult you want to fill in there. That they're somehow or another not as good as you. But you know what? They've spent enough time on that activity to improve their skill to the extent that even though you believe you should be better than them, they are still better than you. And that shouldn't be discouraging. That should be encouraging. It's encouraging to me. That's what's so eye-opening about going to jiu-jitsu. That's what's so eye-opening about going to wrestling or MMA or judo or whatever it is. That you go in there and that you see that, oh, these people worked hard and that's why they're good at this. I can come in here and get beat up by someone that when I look at them with my maybe, and this is of course coming in with no experience, to come in and have the opinion that I should be able to hold my own against this person based on my initial observation, my initial opinion or my first glance at my opponent or whoever it is, my training partner. And then you realize, after you lose that, oh man, this is something I can also learn and this is something I could also use. And this should be evidence to me that if I'm not good at something, I can get good at it. Yeah, even as adults, even as parents, or as teachers, or as mentors, I think we all can kind of sort of lose sight of that idea. And it's very easy to tell children when it comes to a subject that we feel comfortable with. It's easy to tell your younger sibling or your child to learn to be good at the things that you've become good at. To be able to clean up after themselves, to be able to add and subtract, to be able to ride a skateboard, to be able to play a video game at a certain level. Once you get there, it becomes like almost aggravating or annoying that someone else is not good at it. Right? Like, come on, I learned how to walk. You should be able to do it. And then at the same time, it's still at sometimes hard for us. Even me, not just, I'm not talking to all of you guys as if you're all at fault. This is sort of an introspective video, if you couldn't tell. You know that it's hard sometimes, even though you can do that to somebody who's not where you are and tell them, look, I've done it. You should be able to do it. Or to maybe be a little too critical of them because you have that expectation. And then someone still can come along and tell you the same thing about where they are and where you have not yet reached. And they tell you, sure, you can do it. I've done it. I've been right where you are and I've gotten here. So can you. And sometimes it's still so hard for us to see that yes, we can get there. But just remember that they're you in your situation with your child or with your younger sibling or with your student. And they're not wrong. Even if you feel you're terrible at math. Right? And they're telling you can be good at it. They're not wrong. So, talent, no talent. I think some people will find some things easier. I found math to be easy. But you know what? That's not because it was without any work. We all went through school, you know. And I spent a lot of time in elementary school trying to be really good at math, trying to be better than other people in my class at math. This is through kindergarten, through elementary school, through middle school, trying to be really good at it. And then by the time I was in college, I was like, well, I understand how math works because I spent so much time on the basics. And so where someone might see it as I'm just good at math or math is just easy for me, it's just that I've spent a lot of time on it already. And if I spent 500 extra hours on it in my youth or 1,000 extra hours on it in my youth, that's something that honestly someone can do later on in life in much less time. And this is true in grappling too, that if you take a child who trained from, say, 5 years old to 15 years old, that's 10 years of wrestling. The amount of time that it took them to learn all of that stuff, if you take an adult to maybe do this also, and it won't be maybe second nature, as some would say, when a child learns to do something, but you can take an adult and teach them all of that stuff, and they'll learn it in a shorter period of time. Because a child takes a long time to learn. They're good at learning. But they're not particularly fast at it. And you see that if you train a kid or if you teach a kid, that you have to teach them sort of the same thing over and over and over again, and they start to pick up a little piece of it here and there. And say if you teach them how to do an armbar from the guard, and you do it one day out of a week, and you do it for 6 months or so, they might start to get pretty good at it. But I'll tell you, if you do that for an adult, and you taught them to do an armbar from the guard one day a week, they become pretty good at it pretty fast. Because adults have more life experience. They can sort of use their knowledge of other things, and maybe some things more applicable, some things less applicable, some things maybe more abstractly related to it. They've spent more time learning. And as a result, they're sort of better at learning. But that sort of lends itself to this argument, right? That the more time you spend at it, the better you get at it. So, If you feel like you're not good at something, whether it's jiu-jitsu, wrestling, math, just remember that all of those people who do those things were at some point or another also not good at it. You know, it's that old saying, every black belt is just a white belt who didn't quit. So, don't worry about talent. Just worry about getting there. See you guys later.